This is episode 241 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, the COVID situation in New Mexico is precarious, I guess, would be a appropriate term for it. In fact, after ratcheting things up in terms of the restrictions last week, the governor did, from groups of 10 to groups of 5, revised the quarantine restrictions. Restaurants will now be closed at 10 p.m.
If they serve liquor.
If they serve liquor,
yes.
And just kind of general revisions and more restrictions. Also, the Lobo football team had their practices put on hold in a fascinating, that's why you read the fine print on these agreements. Of course, it was more like Darth Vader when he talks about changing the agreement. Pray I don't alter the agreement any further. That's kind of the situation UNM football is in. They are reliant on spread rate in Bernalillo County in order for their football team to play their upcoming game or to have practices. So I think things are looking bleak, if you will, for UNM football, which wasn't directly related to the governor's new pronouncements, but definitely a new development on the COVID front. And then as we record this today, Tuesday morning, the governor has scheduled a press conference for later today. And we can only expect...
It will not be that we're going to loosen things up and have more freedom of movement here in New Mexico. We know that's the case.
I suspect that is exactly right. And, the question is, how low will she go? How far will she go in terms of restrictions? I was in Roswell, New Mexico last night. Southeast New Mexico, of course, more politically conservative than up here in the Rio Grande Valley in Albuquerque, and really frustrated folks down there. Just not the kind of people who are in general supportive of what the governor is doing, and very, very willing to push back actively. And I'm not just talking about average citizens. I'm talking about elected officials who are really trying to push back against the governor and just her making these decisions on her own, seemingly in an arbitrary way. So, Wally, I'll turn it over to you for any additional thoughts you have.
Well, there's no question. We've talked before. This kind of COVID thing is it's a difficult problem without, despite the fact that we talk about science and data, there's actually very little science and data that's predictive in terms of helping figure out what's going on. And the whole idea that masks are a panacea, if just everyone would wear masks and social distance, things won't happen. That's not been the experience around the world or around the country, is that this is a contagious virus, and what it would take and what it is taking to completely, quote unquote, shut the virus down. It's a trite phrase that I'm actually only slightly less tolerant of than the science and the data, and that is the cure worse than the disease. So if people are going to get it, and places that haven't had much of a spread rate in the past and not real high rates tend to actually get their time. And it's not, I think, due to as much of how it's managed. It's just that it's just the randomness of it, meaning that some places get it earlier just by a matter of luck or some errant event, and then they get their time. Well, New Mexico's rate's a little higher than it's been. It's not astronomical. It's not like the hospitals are overflowing with COVID patients. And interestingly, in the higher rate of infection, the death rate is still pretty darn low. The deaths have not gone up while the cases have, which is something that we hoped for and would expect. That was the whole premise of the flatten the curve. Let us learn about, not overwhelm our hospitals, learn about treatment. It seems like we've done both of those things. But now, do we have to go back and are we going to face another shutdown? And if so, in New Mexico, there were payroll protection loans and other things like that that really helped businesses that were forced to shut down the initial time. Well, those monies have come and gone. They're no longer there. And the economic devastation for further shutdowns in many, many industries may, in the words of the saying, you ain't seen nothing yet if there are more restrictions in terms of what businesses will fail and what it will mean economically to New Mexico.
Yeah, and there's a couple of thoughts that I have here relating to this. One is it's pretty clear that the governor's strategy has failed. Just looking at it from the data, New Mexico is middle of the pack in terms of deaths per million from the virus. The spread rate is rising and has been at record levels much the last week or so. Now, the good news is, as you said, the number of people dying is pretty low and hasn't seen a massive uptick. But you've really got to consider that we've been a very strict state in terms of the lockdowns and trying to keep people, out of public life, away from their offices, social events, all kinds of different functions. And yet the spread of the virus itself is not being hindered or hampered. It's coming back in ways that I think, they're record levels, several days in the last week or so. I liken it a little bit to trying to address climate change by reorganizing our entire lives around zero carbon emission technology and the pain and challenge of that, as opposed to a mitigation strategy, which seems to be what we may be succeeding with more, which is we can't stop the absolute spread of the virus, but we can improve treatment of the virus and its conditions. And we've certainly gotten a better grasp on how to address people being sick with the virus. And those, by definition, are relatively targeted treatments focusing on the people who are actually sick, understanding that preventing the spread of a virus over a long period of time. We're over 7 months in now, and according to the last press conference the governor had, the numbers 9 months and 12 months were repeated by both the governor and David Scrace. And I just don't think you're going to get buy-in from broad-based people in New Mexico, regardless of ideology. We've seen Democrats be more supportive. Philosophically, I think they are more supportive. Politically, they're more supportive. But I don't see New Mexicans sticking it out for another 9 months or a year, giving the governor what she wants. And I just don't see her understanding or reacting to human reality in this whole situation. She's trying to fit a square peg through a round hole when it comes to the way people want to live their lives.
Well, and then the way they can live their lives. One of the
Exactly.
things that I was really focused on that I think got really not nearly as much as attention as it should have is the supply chain, in the meat industry and the grocery, and it was that system proved to be, despite some problems. There are packing plants that shut down. There was lots of animals that were basically slaughtered and not been able to use for food because of it. But that system proved to be more resilient than I was afraid it was. It proved to be pretty. There was a time there when there were certain grocery items on the shelves that were a little bit in short supply, but we had a bounty compared to a normal day in the old Soviet Union. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So we've always had things. So that's been very, very good. But the Whole aspect is our unemployment fund is depleted in New Mexico. Revenues for government are down, although the federal government, despite the fact that a lot of people in New Mexico like to say that, oh, Washington isn't helping us. Washington has helped the state of New Mexico tremendously with lots and lots of money, but there may not be another round of that. So, what do we do now as a state? I think the pain will start to be more direct and more apparent and in more sectors than it has before. And unless and until it starts to hit government funding for state and local government, it seems like then New Mexico doesn't have a problem. Well, I have a feeling we're on the cusp of that, and not that long until the legislative session gets going in Santa Fe, and we'll have to see where we are. But I think the pain might be felt in the place that New Mexico feels it, where businesses and employees that work for businesses have been feeling it since day one.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what you just said. First and foremost, one wonders, will the legislature, it's one thing to have a special session in a virtual context where you have a very short and specific list of agenda items like we did back in June. It's a very different animal to try to do a legislative session 60 days in nature, which is kind of obviously the long, but also the more freewheeling session where legislators can introduce all kinds of different bills. Given what the governor's been saying, given the fact that you and I both know we've been to Santa Fe many, many times during legislative sessions, it is known as the petri dish of New Mexico. And
it's cold and flu season on the best of years.
yes, so how is that all going to work out? But secondly, capitalism is freaking amazing, because if you had asked me 7 months ago, it reminds me of the whole Rush Limbaugh line, I'm doing battle with one half my brain tied behind my back.
Yeah.
Capitalism is literally fighting to supply us with all these goods and things that we expect to go to the grocery store. And yeah, there were some toilet paper supply issues early on when just people were going nuts, but overall, capitalism is so freaking good at supplying the stuff that we need on a day-to-day basis. Now, government is going to be hurting for money when Washington runs out of the printing press, and eventually they will. There's going to be challenges ahead for a lot of individual families and a lot of people, but by and large, the ability to go into a store right now and see the depth and breadth of products that are available, even during this global pandemic, with all the restrictions that governments have placed on businesses and whatnot, it is pretty astonishing and breathtaking. And I think it's worth acknowledging just how amazing this system is, because you're right, it is blowing communism and socialism out of the water on its worst days, and that really should give us pause when we consider this fall's election and some of the policymakers that are running for office under very left-wing banners. But one last thing on the COVID situation, and who knows what the governor's going to come up with today. We'll have plenty to talk about with that next week, and hopefully it's just an update, but I fear that the beatings will continue until morale improves. I want to read quickly from an article that was on KOB News, because Channel 4 KOB, and the story was from October the 16th, so it's recent. There's been a lot of concern and questions about capacity at hospitals like UNMH. And Dr. David Pitcher was quoted in this KOB article, and he says most of the fullness of the hospital beds is related to delayed demand for care as a result of the initial COVID-19 wave. It's not so much demand for COVID-related illness admissions as they are currently happening. And it said, as of the Friday before this story was produced, COVID-related patients represented less than 10% of the overall patient cases at the full hospital. So the admissions, the ER is full, but less than 10% of those cases are actually COVID. And so you get these news stories saying hospitals are full, hospitals are full. And I believe the governor actually said this kind of thing in her last press conference. And so we're left with, and many people are left with the idea that because of COVID, we're not able to handle this latest wave. When the reality is that over 90%, according to the hospital itself, are not COVID patients themselves.
Yes, and the next phase of that is to say that actually shutting down the hospital to treat only COVID patients in the not too distant future would make the hospital situation worse than actually keeping it open right now for ongoing care. And anyone who's been in a hospital setting knows is that people in the hospital, they're pretty good at getting you out of there if you don't need to be there. We're not talking about frivolous items being treated in the hospital. We're talking about cancer. We're talking about heart disease, diabetes. And the whole host of things above and beyond all of the accidents and broken bones and all the things that happen. And so, yes, very good point. And it just shows that economics is a funny thing, and it provides a pretty good framework to analyze this situation. Is that, yeah, if we shut down the hospitals, they're going to be more overrun in the future than if we do what we need to do to manage them in a COVID-safe way, keep them open going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the future, of course. Well, the past, not too distant past, when they were shut down to anybody but COVID-related patients, those people form the basis of the current fullness of our hospitals because they had delayed care. And so a future shutdown of hospitals to anything but COVID would result in the same kind of situation. Let's move on to more economic-oriented policies. And a new report from the Pew Charitable Trusts reported by thecentersquare.com and also posted on Errors of Enchantment. This Pew report notes that New Mexico had the fourth highest volatility in tax revenue collection over the last 20 years. And that is a challenge for policymakers. We note in our blog post, this isn't something the Pew or even the Center Square noted, but the challenge, I believe, is that it's because, well, we have oil and gas, and that is something we over-rely on, 40% of our budget, well documented. Now, the thing that people may not know, and this includes reporters and the Pew Center, we list in our blog post at Errors of Enchantment the other states that neighbor us and the volatility number. It's a volatility numbers aren't like other numbers. You can't necessarily judge them easily against each other. But among states in our region, Texas actually has the least volatile tax revenue by quite a bit.
Even though it's a huge oil and gas state.
Exactly. And
but the reason is they have a very large private sector economy outside of the energy sector, and New Mexico, unfortunately, does not. Is that kind of how you're seeing it, Paul?
You're like a Jeopardy contestant who just hit that buzzer before Alex got the question out of his mouth. Yes, that is exactly right. It's not necessarily the fact that we have oil and gas. And now this is, of course, a lot of liberals and progressives will say, well, we should keep it in the ground. That way we'll have less tax volatility.
Yeah, and we will. We will. Bankrupt, guess what? If you have no tax revenues and everything goes to zero, guess what? Volatility goes to zero, meaning zero never changes. So
exactly. And that is our big problem and challenge here in New Mexico is that as the Rio Grande Foundation consistently argues, we do need to diversify our economy, but diversifying our economy does not mean shutting down oil and gas and then searching for other ways to fund government. It means adopting policies like Texas has, starting off the top of my head, like a zero income tax, like a right to work law, and many other policies that will enhance our ability to attract the kinds of businesses that Texas already has. Now, it'll take time, even if we were to have a absolute miracle and the legislature this session were to enact those kinds of policies, which, barring a true miracle on election day, will not happen. But the fact is that uh, it does take some time to earn your bona fides as a business-friendly state. But the longer we avoid having these difficult discussions about reforming New Mexico public policy, the longer we're just going to be pushed to the side economically. And the real prospect, as Professor Peach in our recent podcast talked about, is he thinks, and I'm not going to disagree with this. I'm not going to say I believe 100% of it, but he is saying, and a lot of people are saying, that the future of oil and gas is not particularly pretty. He thinks that over time, oil and gas will decline in terms of just net production, let alone demand, or all the things that we have relied on, because demand will fall over time as our economy moves away from those two products. Now, he may or may not be correct, but the writing seems to be on the wall. Certainly, you would think that maybe it's a time to consider economic diversification in New Mexico and try to do our best during a time of struggles in the oil patch, that this would be a warning sign to go ahead and enact some free market policies that'll make us in a little better position on the volatility alone, but just in general, moving forward to be more attractive to business.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And the issue with regard to oil and gas is wasn't that many years ago people started to talk about peak oil, meaning we've produced all the oil we ever can produce. And so they talked about peak oil in terms of supply. Well, now people are talking about peak oil in terms of demand.
Exactly.
And the key is that those who think that we won't be using oil 100 years from now, it's one of those, I won't be here to see it, but I would like to make a long-term bet that I place in my estate. Oil is just too valuable, and where batteries are, where all these other technologies are, I'm not sure that they'll be ready to take over the entire economy in 1,000 years, much less 100, but I'm pretty confident about 100. And so why is oil going down? Well, back in the 70s when we put catalytic converters on our cars, my dad bought a large pickup truck that I think driving around town got 7 or 8 miles to the gallon. Well, now you have a large pickup truck that will be getting, 15, 16, 18, 20 miles to the gallon. Just improvements like that cause there to be less use of oil. Doesn't mean it's not going to be there, but yes, can we rely on oil to pull New Mexico out of its problems? We can, and to this point we have, but that does not mean that that's a good long-term strategy necessarily. It's like, what else do we need to do to get our economy going, and what are the inputs, as you pointed out, that are necessary? I mean, always top of my mind. It's not a list of. It's not a complicated list. It's like I always put reform of gross receipts tax would be one. Making sure we have a quality education system. Making sure that crime is under control and people feel safe in their homes. You know what? That's a pretty good list right there. You make significant progress on those three. I think economic development in New Mexico gets a whole heck of a lot easier, and we could be a rapid economic power in just a few years. Will that happen? I don't know. What do you think,
Magic
Paul?
8 Ball is not looking very good.
It's not looking good right
but,
now.
we'll know a lot more after.
Well, let me look at
November.
the 8 Ball. It says check back in a year, and I'll let you know. So
I think check back in a month, and we'll know a heck of a lot more. Not even a month. Just to be clear on this, when you talk about volatility, that should not be taken to mean that New Mexico suffers from a lack of tax revenue or money flowing into the government on a consistent long-term basis. It simply means that over time, you get a lot of ups and a lot of downs as oil production grows and prices go up, and then things change and you move in the opposite direction. We, in a separate post, noted that New Mexico's tax burden is indeed heavy, seventh highest in the entire country as a percentage of income. And again, as we usually do, we rate this against our neighbors. Federation of Tax Administrators data, New Mexico is at 8.5%. This is state burdens. You can go to state and local, and you won't find much of a difference. New Mexico has high tax burdens as a percentage of income across the board. Utah is at 6.5 or so percent. Sorry, my own text is a little small for my dying eyes here, but 5.75. I mean, we're way above the percentage at the state level relative to other neighboring states. And we have those permanent funds that provide some bulwark in down economic times for oil and gas and just down times in general. So we have rainy day funds and the like, and those are all well and good. But in general, the idea that New Mexico does not spend enough money or doesn't have enough tax revenue flowing in could not be further from the truth. And we know that this will be a discussion item for the legislature. Professor Peach himself mentioned this in an Albuquerque Journal column. We didn't get to talk too much detail about raising taxes, but there is no doubt that if the election goes the way that we fear, we certainly hope that the legislature is a little more sane than it has been, but chances are also good that it could go the other way. We fully expect that tax increases will be on the table yet again. I mean, heck, they raised taxes at a time of $1 billion surplus. You don't think the Democrats in Santa Fe are perfectly capable of raising taxes when we're facing the kind of revenue crunch and economic uncertainty we face now? So, even though businesses are in dire shape and full swaths of our economy are facing incredible challenges, these people look at government, and we've talked about this. I think this is the central organizing principle of New Mexico government, is that government is not here to support and make conditions ripe for businesses. Government is first and foremost there to make sure that itself is funded, and that if businesses can survive, that's great.
Yeah, well, or that's at least okay, but that's not the point. Well, Paul, I have a couple of observations. One is the difference between reserves and permanent funds. And so the permanent funds of New Mexico are dedicated for certain purposes, from severance taxes and from mineral production and other revenues, almost all oil and gas on state trust lands. And those funds have built up into the billions of dollars. I haven't looked recently. The combination of the two is somewhere around $20 billion. So the earnings from that is a huge amount of funding for education and the rest of the state operations. One of the things that when something's volatile, you want to have additional reserves. And starting under Susana Martinez in the 2007, 2008 timeframe, reserves became much more important, and the legislature has seen that maybe that is more valuable than they initially thought, having some more money. And all that said is it's a lot like the family finances, is to have some money that if someone loses their job, or in this case, the tax volatility of oil and gas is such that the revenues don't come in, you don't have all of this upheaval in the operations of your state. I think those are good things. I think we probably need more of those. And then the other issue that I wanted to talk about is when you talk about tax burden as a percentage of revenue, it's a little like volatility. There's two ways you can make that go. If New Mexicans had the same tax burden and made more money, then that percentage would go down quite a bit. But the bottom line is we're taxed relatively highly. Our incomes are relatively low, and so therefore the percentage is high. Well, it's back to that economic development approach, creating jobs that actually pay decent wages, all the good things that that does for the state and what policies are necessary. But again, a lot of interrelated issues that really have a big impact on the state of New Mexico. And then the final thought is that any reforms that are made, any progress is made, the other thing that makes it tough politically is there's not a magic wand that you can wave, that even if everything was done perfectly from a policy point of view, it takes some time for these things to go forward and to become effective. And in addition to that, it takes a while for people that are looking to invest in the state to be confident that these changes won't be undone quickly. So that's the other thing. It's one thing to say, okay, we're going to cut taxes. But if you're a business and you see the state cuts taxes when times are good and raises them when times are bad, you're thinking, well, this tax cut is not not necessarily something to be relied on when I'm making an investment decision in terms of whether I want to operate my business in New Mexico or not.
No doubt about it. Great points. And I think the fundamental challenge here is that if people feel like and are getting a great return on the tax dollars that they are having taxed away, we're getting a world-class education system. The tax burden is done in such a way that it's fair and relatively transparent and not harmful to businesses. You can do other things well. You can have good public safety and succeed just fine. But unfortunately, and you see this in studies, I think it's Wallet Hub that has one of these reports showing that New Mexicans do not get much bang for their buck when it comes to government taxation. And that is a reality, I think, that we all live with here in New Mexico. And even if you think your tax burden is just fine, it could go up, you have to be asked, and any honest answer would say that we are not getting much bang for our buck in terms of a high quality education system. And that translates into higher education as well. Public safety is not particularly good in the criminal justice system, et cetera. So we could be doing a lot better. But our view is that we can do both better in terms of these outcomes as well as having a lower tax burden if we focused our attention on core functions of government, not film subsidies, not just massive investments in branch campuses all over our state and higher education, not administrative bloat at the public school districts and PED. And of course, we also need to open our economy up. And we also posted a chart from the Legislative Finance Committee in which we showed that, the Bureau of Labor Statistics showed the pain of the lockdowns is not at all being shared equitably. And they looked at employment by industry, 2019 August, 2020 August, so over the span of a year. There are some industries that are getting absolutely hammered. Mining and logging, which
is oil and gas in New Mexico, the preponderance.
Exactly. So that's down 30.3%. Leisure and hospitality, which of course is tourism, which it amazes me that it's only down 29%. But depending on how you factor those folks in, certainly tourism has been completely hammered as well. Now, governments, not so much. And I think this is kind of getting back to the philosophical underpinning of New Mexico government is, when you talk about we're all in this together, we're really not, because if you are getting a government paycheck, you are more than likely still seeing a consistent paycheck. You may not even be working as hard. I'm not saying not all. Some are. Some are working harder. I certainly know some teachers are putting in a lot of extra hours to make sure that the online classes really work. But overall, government is very consistent, down only 3.3%.
And when you're down 3.3%, that's probably, retirement and normal turnovers. You don't fill a few positions. When you're down 30%, that's dramatic, like energy and tourism and restaurants and the like.
Now, it's fair to say that the governor perhaps could not really do anything directly to bring oil and gas jobs back. That's a global market. We've seen tremendous volatility and declines in general in prices in the oil and gas sector. We've, that is maybe beyond governor's control. Leisure and hospitality, of course, that is largely under her control. And I think there are, from the quarantine to the cancellation of major events, there are a lot of ways that she could have mitigated against some of the harms of those policies. But it is worth noting that the unemployment rate in our state in general, this is according to a Wallet Hub report. So looking at the start of 2020, so January 1, 2020, New Mexico has had the second least amount of recovery in its unemployment rate. We are 50th. I think they lumped the District of Columbia in there. Only Florida has experienced a more challenged recovery than we have here. And since the same week last year, so this was, I think, a week in early October, New Mexico is 47th overall. Massachusetts, Georgia, Indiana, and Kansas are among the slowest to recover unemployment-wise. And it's worth noting that New Mexico is consistently one of the higher states, especially during the recent, kind of booming economy. We suffered greatly for much of the Martinez years. We talked about the unemployment insurance issue and kind of the sluggishness of our state level economy, which really only kicked into high gear upon the election of Donald J. Trump and the energy market boom and all the success we had. But still, our unemployment rate was among the top 5 or 8 highest in the country. And so that means this recovery is all the more anemic based on the fact that we started at a higher place. Florida, I think before the recovery, before the COVID hit, was in the 3% or so range. We were in the 5% or so range. So they had a number to come back to.
Yeah, no question. And there's, just when you look at Florida, Florida has a relatively diversified economy, but they also have a lot of tourism, and certainly the COVID crisis has damaged that industry, regardless of whether you're open or not. You know what I mean? The level of air travel down dramatically. About the only time I see airplanes traveling now is night, and those tend to not be passengers. Those tend to be UPS, FedEx, Amazon, and the like, flying packages back and forth across the country. But the other interesting aspect for New Mexico is, the tourism industry, which was basically a big industry for New Mexico, is also suffering dramatically. And so we have oil and gas down tremendously. We have tourism down tremendously. We don't have huge amounts of private sector activity and employment outside of those two industries, relatively speaking. So New Mexico is finding itself increasingly between a rock and a hard place. And so, we have our challenges to go forward.
All right, Wally, we only have a few minutes left in this podcast, but we've had some requests specifically to take a look at the ballot. And I know early balloting is already happening, early voting. You haven't voted yet?
No, I almost made it the other day, but then I got a phone call. I had to run back and jump on a Zoom meeting. But in the next day or two, I plan to go, because maybe I ought to go before the announcement. Maybe we can't vote in person after this afternoon, although I don't believe that's going to be the case.
No, I doubt it. And, so much of what's on the ballot, there are a lot of partisan races. We cannot take partisan positions on those races. If you're looking for signers of the pledge, go to riograndefoundation.org/pledge, and you can find that information. There's a boatload of judges for retention and whatnot. So we can really talk here about the constitutional amendments and some of the bonds. And really, there's 2 constitutional amendments. One is relating to transforming the PRC from a 5-member elected statewide board to a 3-member appointed board. We have had two different guests, Kenneth Costello, kind of sharing the general perspective of the Rio Grande Foundation. It's a close call, but we support that issue. We had Jefferson Byrd, PRC commissioner, with the alternative perspective. I think there's good arguments on both sides, but overall, despite the governor being kind of behind this whole PRC adjustment, I just think you're going to get overall better commissioners, more responsibility for the body and its outcomes. And you go down the ballot in an average election, and very few people know who their PRC commissioners are and what that body even does. And I think it's better to have those kinds of people nominated and put forth by a governor, as opposed to, kind of that, who do I vote for now for the PRC? Oh, I'm just going to vote for, well, I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote for them, or I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote for them.
Well, and that is a problem with some of these down ballot races, and particularly with the judges that have partisan distinctions. It's pretty hard to know who your person is or to know much about them. It is indeed a very diligent voter that has knowledge about the specifics of any given judge, much less whether their PRC commissioner is good, bad, or indifferent. And I do find it interesting on the PRC. You and I off air have had a little bit of disagreement. My underlying premise is that whether it's appointed or elective, having high quality commissioners is the key to a well functioning regulatory commission. And the old saying, I'm old enough that I remember back when we had a appointed commission that performed so poorly that's why the elected commission was brought into play. And so it's interesting. Everything is old is new again. But I do think that will be an interesting one, because you're asking a voter that we've already said may lack a lot of knowledge and on any specifics, to say, do you want less power in the ballot box and give more to the administration on this particular nebulous, not well known, not well understood, but very important agency? We'll have to see how that turns out. And then the judges, it's one of those, I've seen more campaigning for judges than I ever have, in terms of some relatively good stuff. Will that make a difference between the number of R's registered in New Mexico versus the number of D's? We'll have to wait and see. I have a feeling no, but that will be an interesting one.
Well, let me jump in on a constitutional amendment before.
Oh yeah, before you judge. Oh yeah, you bet.
We have a proposal on Amendment 2. So we just talked about Amendment 1.
Yes.
There's a second proposal which essentially is going to extend the times of some statewide offices, mostly judges, in order to kind of even out the ballots and to allow for less overall ballot length on one particular election, so that they can kind of be staggered.
Yeah, they'll evenly staggered once it's fully implemented.
And I don't have an issue with that. I realize that there's political monkey business that can happen, but I'm all for trying to even out the ballot and stagger those situations a little bit better. Unfortunately, back in the 80s, New Mexico adopted a constitutional amendment with regard to the state Senate that wound up putting them all in 1 year. So we are in a year where you will have every state senator up. I would much rather see the 4-year terms of the senators around the state of New Mexico staggered, so that you don't have every single one of them up in a given year.
And it's always a presidential year as well.
But alas, that is not the way things are anymore. So, would love almost to see that extended. And then we get into bonds. And I'm not going to discuss bonds in a broad sense, except to say that the higher education bond is the one that I would most notably consider a no vote on, simply because the higher ed system, especially when it comes to construction, has grown to broad and too quickly, and just so much money poured into higher education for such mediocre results. We also have students not even physically going to campus. I think higher education in particular needs a reevaluation, and while they will tell you that your vote does not result in a tax increase, the obvious flip side is that a no vote in a defeat, I mean, it has to be a defeat of a bond, will likely result in lower taxes. And the higher ed bond is particularly high in terms of how much, over $100 million, $150 million, I think. So I will say that for every bond. And of course, there's also bonds that seemingly are written in a way to give one impression, and then the politicians kind of use that money for something that doesn't necessarily seem directly related to what the bond was passed for in the first place. So those are my general admonitions. But overall, folks, go vote early. I strongly encourage folks to get out there and vote early because of just the who knows what's going to be happening on election day. So with that, thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.